Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Mr. Fulcher's World History class at Wyman King Academy, live from my house because the whole world is still shut down. Hope everyone's been enjoying your time away. Hope your little brothers and sisters haven't driven you absolutely insane. Hopefully there's not been any strangulations in the family so far. But I wanted to kind of make sure that I wanted to create this YouTube channel just to give you an opportunity to kind of get some actual lessons while I'm gone, in case there's some stuff that maybe you didn't quite grasp, or just going over on the. I know you've read some of this stuff in your textbook, but obviously sometimes it's helpful to have someone explaining stuff to you, and so I wanted to make sure I was doing this to help you a little bit. I'm struggling not having a podium here because this textbook is 8,000 pounds, and if this whole coronavirus thing turns into a deal where like people are like rioting or looting, like this is nearly as good as having a firearm right here just to club people over the head. If you need to. Hopefully none of that happens. But anyway, so today I want to take a little bit of a look at World War One. Our world history class normally starts at 10 a.m. and instead it's 10 p.m. This is a night owl's dream. I'm loving this part of it, but I'll still be excited to see you guys again one of these days. But anyway, so today I kind of wanted to go over again the road that leads us to World War One. And of course, World War One is going to be a war that, as the name implies, it was called the Great War at the time that it happened. People didn't call it World War One until the second one broke out. But so where does the Great War come from? It winds up involving literally the entire world. It's predominantly fought in Europe. It's a little less global than World War II in terms of having a little bit less of an Eastern front and so forth. But but some Asian countries get involved, like Japan. America gets involved. And so it goes across the world, but it is. The roots of World War One are predominantly rooted in European history, and really it's the culmination of the history of the 19th century, even though it happens in the early 20th. Really, the process, if you remember kind of when we last left off talking about European history, the 1800s after the Napoleonic War, European history takes a dramatic turn with the French Revolution. And then with Napoleon and his attempted conquest of Europe. And then after that, the remaining period of time in European history, really from the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the Congress of Vienna all the way up to World War One, is this period of Europe trying to deal with the tensions that were introduced to European culture by the French Revolution. You have periods like the Age of Metternich where the more conservative or reactionary forces were carrying the day, and then you have periods, especially towards the end, where the more radical forces were succeeding. But largely, the 1800s in Europe is largely the story of European governments trying to grapple with this idea of revolutionary nationalism, and we've talked about how that led to the dissolution or fracturing of some countries, especially these kind of large multi-ethnic empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire that's going to be at the center of this whole thing, at least at this point. But it all, and then things like the Greeks breaking off from the Ottomans and so forth. But then also you have this factor of it unifying several other nations, specifically the German and Italian city-states that coalesced into the independent nations of Germany and Italy, respectively. And we've talked about that already. But you just got to kind of keep in mind that that's the backdrop of World War One, and where all this revolutionary nationalism, where this whole ideology leads us to ultimately is World War One, combined with, especially, this is taken to the next level by imperialism. So the 1800s, the European countries do some pretty rough stuff in conquering many of the nations of Africa and Asia. Pretty much the vast majority of Africa outside of Ethiopia, and many parts of Asia get conquered as well. Other parts like China are not conquered, but are impacted negatively in ways that they feel a loss of sovereignty. We mentioned Japan was kind of the exception to this, because they become kind of the first Asian nation to really modernize and industrialize and kind of take a seat, with a lot of the leading powers of the West. But ultimately, the race for empire, this trying to gobble up the remaining parts of the world by these European powers, compounds the tensions that were already there with nationalism. And then you have the development of a major arms race in Europe. In particular, as it relates to naval vessels, Germany really goes out of its way to start to build a strong navy in the late 1800s. And the British take this as a direct challenge, because if you remember, the British are the dominant power at sea from the defeat of the Spanish Armada, 1588, all the way until World War II. England controls the sea. And so they see this massive German naval arms build up, and they kind of see that and interpret that as a direct challenge to the authority of the British Empire, which is, of course, at its height, in the period immediately preceding the war. And so you have this general sense of militarism, of people becoming, a lot of these countries are building up these new advanced militaries, and they honestly want a chance to show them off. And so it ultimately is going to lead us on the path of war. Also, Europe kind of gets entangled diplomatically into a couple competing alliance systems. So, if you remember, one of the leading figures in German history, in the young history of the German nation was, the young history of the German nation as it relates to being a nation state. They obviously had existed through the Holy Roman Empire and so forth. But, the first major figure of the German nation state is Otto von Bismarck. And Bismarck, when he gets out of the way, they're kind of, he was a diplomatic master kind of pulling strings. And when Bismarck is out of the way, Germany is going to wind up going on the path to war. But Bismarck has some responsibility for it too, because he tried to create this alliance system opposing the French. He understood that France was still going to be sore from the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, which led to ultimately the unification of Germany, but also led to them losing the borderland, the French losing the borderland of Alsace-Lorraine, which is going to come up again throughout the World War I and II. So Germany really kind of wanted to create an alliance system to around isolating France, and that was connected with Bismarck's diplomacy. It leads to the creation of something known as the Triple Alliance, which involved Austria-Hungary and Italy. But 1890, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was the second Kaiser of Germany, forces Bismarck to resign. And, Wilhelm II is a very, very egotistical human being. Your textbook shares the anecdote that one time someone asked him, if he had a little cold after he was sniffling. He said, no, it's mine, so it's a big cold. Everything about me is big. So Kaiser Wilhelm II, a very vainglorious individual, didn't want to share the spotlight with Bismarck at all. And Wilhelm II has a militaristic streak, an imperialistic streak. He really wants to prove, the strength of Germany on the world stage, and that is going to lead to him really building up the arms race. He winds up letting a treaty with Russia lapse, which ultimately leads to Russia signing a treaty with France and Britain that is known as the Triple Alliance. So you've got the Triple Entente. It's Germany and Austria being the core of it, along with Italy. And then you have the Triple Alliance, the British, the French, the Russians. And you'll notice, throughout most of European history, we have looked at the British and French and thought that, these people hate each other, right? They fought the 100 Years' War, the various wars of secession, of, this secession and that secession. Ultimately, though, Britain and France are going to become allies by treaty with this moment, and will kind of remain such for the rest of history up to this point. Although they still probably have little resentments towards each other, or what have you. But they work together on things. The powder keg of Europe, though, was the Balkan Mountain region, down in southern Europe. The lands that we refer to as Greece and Yugoslavia. And you have a lot of this some of this territory belonged to the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire that at this point in time is starting to diminish in power. Some of it belongs to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which, if you remember, they were a dual monarchy with one king sitting on the throne of two administrative apparatuses, an Austrian one and a Hungarian one. They did that to preserve the empire against nationalist rebels. And you have some young new countries as well in that region, Serbia and Bulgaria and Albania and a few different ones. And so there are, Austria and Hungary wind up taking some land that the Serbians thought still belonged to them. And so a lot of people in Serbia resented Austria-Hungary. Well, Franz Ferdinand, who was an archduke, he was the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was not a particularly well-liked person. He pays a state visit to Sarajevo. Sarajevo being the capital of the Bosnian region, and there was a Serbian nationalist by the name of Gavrilo Princip. He's 19 years old, proving that you don't have to be very old to destroy the world, because Gavrilo Princip causes World War I, which we'll talk about in a second, which I think is the single greatest tragedy in the history of mankind that I am aware of. So, Gavrilo Princip was a member of a terrorist organization or a radical organization known as the Black Hand, which, I mean, it sounds like something out of a James Bond movie, but it was like a real thing. And it was a conspiracy, it was a cabal within parts of Serbian military intelligence, which opens up the question of how much did the Serbian government know, and when did they know it, about what was about to happen. We'll talk about that in a second, because it is a big deal as it relates to the question of who really started World War I. So Ferdinand is in a carriage, being carried to his visit. His wife is there as well, and Princip was one of 6 assassins who was on hand. He happened to be the one that got the shot off, but he's one of these Black Hand Serbian radicals. And the reason he didn't like Franz Ferdinand was a supporter of this idea of making Austria-Hungary, they called it, so Austria-Hungary was a dual kingdom. He wanted to make it a triple kingdom and give some recognition to some of the Slavic people there in Austria-Hungary, kind of create a third zone. The Serbians didn't like this because they thought that would end the chance of them getting that land back if they got more independence. So Princip is party to this plot. He winds up taking a gun, and as the carriage is going by, he makes a jump at it, fires the shot, kills the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir. He was going to be the king when the current emperor dies. And so this Austrian prince is dead, and it creates a chain reaction, because what happens next is, Austria-Hungary basically wants to make Serbia pay. And Serbia is going to be issued an ultimatum called the July Ultimatum. Austria is going to give them over a dozen things that they want them to do. Serbia is willing to do some of them, but not all of them. And because they reject this ultimatum, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia in 1914, and this is the beginning of World War I. So what you're probably thinking now is, well, how in the world does this little conflict inside of the Balkan Mountain region turn into worldwide conflagration? What causes this? And the correct answer is Who knows? At one level, and then on the other hand, I'll spend a lot of time explaining it. See, here's the problem with World War One, because there's a few, as a historian, sometimes the more you study, the more it's harder to remain firm on opinions because you read so many experts with conflicting takes on things. There's one thing I've learned in history that I am firm on this, and that is I believe World War One was like the greatest tragedy and the greatest act of stupidity maybe in the history of civilization. I have no idea why no one in Europe and the world couldn't just sit back and say, what are we doing, as they marched literally millions of people to their deaths. But unfortunately, people were too tied up in these, imperial contest to consider the ramifications of the forces that they were loosing in the world. And the problem with World War One, when a war is good, when a war is just, when a war is justified, you typically, can kind of explain it in a sentence most of the time, right? You'd be like, why did we fight World War II? To stop the Germans from taking over the world. Okay, good. That makes sense. But you. But if you just say, what was World War One about? I have to give you a 30-minute lecture because there's no other way to explain it. You can't summarize World War One in a couple of sentences. Why was World War One fought? I mean, you have to basically listen to a 20-minute explanation to get the thumbnail. Even on these videos spanning across a couple videos, we're just going to be scratching the surface of the causes of World War One. It's very complicated. There's a lot of diplomacy and stuff that if we were doing college level classes, we could go a little bit deeper and what all led to that. You just need to get the highlights. So the question is, if everyone is marching to war and no one can explain why, that's not a good sign. Like you don't want to fight a war that doesn't make any sense. You don't want to fight a war that you can't explain to the soldier why he's going to the front. And so there's just but there's this chain reaction that starts. And so the first thing that happens, so Austria, Hungary, and Serbia, this is kind of conflict that in the old days would just be a single power war, but it kind of triggers an avalanche for a few reasons. One was, so Russia was dealing with, they're dealing with the radicals domestically. The Tsar is, and the Russian kingdom is kind of in decline. We're going to talk about the Russian Revolution in not long here. But so you got the Tsar kind of hanging on to trying to hang on to prestige. Russia's kind of been humiliated, losing a war to the Japanese, and a whole bunch of stuff. Ultimately, he really wants to support the Serbs to advance this idea. He was trying to kind of make Russia the protector of the Slavic peoples. So there was this kind of pan-Slavic nationalism, meaning all the people of the Slavic ethnicity being kind of protected by the Russian Tsar was this vision that he had. And so Serbia was kind of what you would call a client state of Russia. Russia had an awful lot of influence with them. And so Russia is going to want to come to the aid. Excuse me, I shouldn't touch my face. Everyone keeps telling me touching your face kills you nowadays. But anyway, I'm sorry, my nose itch. What am I supposed to do? I don't understand. Follow the guidelines. Follow the guidelines. Anyway, so Russia, though, is going to start mobilizing for war here. Meanwhile, Germany is going to get pulled into this very quickly because Austria is an ally of theirs. Russia, there's now tension now between Russia and Austria. And then the Germans have this alliance with the Russians. Well, the Germans also kind of had rivalry with Russia as well. And ultimately, when the Russians expected the Germans to get involved, so they mobilized a lot of troops on the German border to be prepared if stuff goes down. Well, the Germans saw this and said, well, this is all the justification we need. This is an act of war. Russia's about to invade. Well, if we're about to invade, we need to get in right away. So Germany then declares war on Russia. So now you've got Russia and Serbia on this side. You got Germany and Austria on the other. Then, what nobody knew was that France and Russia had signed a secret treaty that anyone that goes to war with one had to, if the other was invaded, the other would have to defend them. So France gets involved with the Russians, and so you create a system where you now have two alliance systems that were loosely based with some changes on the Triple Alliance and Triple Entente. You have the Central Powers, because they were focused on Central Europe, which is Austria, Germany, and also the Ottoman Empire. The Turks get involved as well. One of the underrated legacies of World War I is how much it sets the stage for the modern Middle East. So you have the Central Powers on one side, and then you have the Allied powers on the other, which started with Serbia, going to include Russia and France. And then we're going to see how that the British are going to get sucked in as well. And the reason the British get sucked in is that Germany is faced. I wish I was in the classroom and had my maps here so I could show you. Germany is in a tough spot in World War I because at the time they bordered both Russia and France. They've put a couple more countries now between Germany and Russia, but they still border France. So you've got France on one side, you got Russia on the other. So Germany's in a tough spot there. So the thing is, they had already had a plan. They had a plan for how they were going to handle this. It was a plan that they called the Schlieffen Plan, named after the general that came up with it. And the Schlieffen Plan called for the Germans to move swiftly through France, take out Paris, and kind of knock the French out of the war before Russia could really bring their full force to the conflict. Well, here's the problem, though. The problem is that the French, the planned invasion of France went through the nation of Belgium. Well, Belgium had a treaty with the British that said and Belgium was trying to stay neutral. They were trying to keep out of it. And instead, the Germans invaded Belgium to get to France. The British had given a war guarantee to Belgium that they would fight to defend Belgian freedom and Belgian sovereignty. And then, obviously, in addition to that, you also have reports of German atrocities and things happening in Belgium as well. Germany of World War I is not quite Germany of World War II. On the atrocity level, but there was, Kaiser Wilhelm was not a good guy either. He was a militaristic conqueror. He's kind of he's a monarch, and the German army did commit, some atrocities. Although I'm sure you can probably find some Allied ones too if you look. German army still not the good guys in this one either, but. But World War I, it's hard to say. It's not as black and white as World War II, where you've got one side clearly trying to conquer the world, and the other side clearly trying to defend it. It really is a big imperial squabble. It's really a bunch of all the rulers of Europe are like a bunch of kids who didn't understand how to play nice with each other anymore. It's just, but in exchange for all that, they're going to cost literally millions of lives. A disaster casualty rates that were unprecedented in the history of warfare. We'll talk about why in some of the next lessons here as we talk about how dramatically the military technology of World War I was different from the last major war. But ultimately, you've now got the situation where Britain has come in on that side. We'll see in a couple years the Americans will get pulled into it, but we'll get to that when we get there. For now, we're trying to stay neutral, although we slightly favor the Allied side because of our economic ties with Britain. But ultimately, World War I gets started in 1914, and one of there was a British official who made the statement that the lights have gone out across Europe and they may not be lit again in our lifetime. And he was absolutely right. It was a disaster that set the stage for everything. If you could go back in time and stop these idiots from starting World War I, you could have prevented World War II. You could have prevented the Russian Revolution that led to the Soviet Union taking over Russia and instilling the world's first communist regime. You could have potentially stopped the Cold War. You could have potentially stopped the Holocaust. There's 100 bad things that came. And in fact, if you look at the legacy of how World War I plays out, maybe some of our recent misadventures in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan, would have gone a different way, and we might have had less of a problem with Islamic terrorism if not for some of the ways that World War One redraws the borders of the Middle Eastern world. Um, so anyway, all that to say, it's World War One is a mess. You know, many people die in battle. Many civilians die, and many people die of disease as well. We're in the middle of a pretty bad pandemic right now, but probably the worst pandemic of recent centuries was the 1918 Spanish flu. And that happens in the midst of World War One, and soldiers are passing it back and forth amongst each other, which really made it even worse. So it's just a disaster, an absolute disaster, the dumbest thing mankind maybe has ever done. And we're still living with negative consequences from it, 100+ years later. So we'll talk in our next video about kind of how the war gets rolling. But this has been the path to the great disaster. So anyway, on that inspiring note, y'all have yourselves a good day.